If you ever hear your house breathe, don't ignore it. Ethan Caldwell stood still in the dim light of a rented Montana farmhouse, those words replaying in his mind like a warning he never asked for, yet couldn't forget. The place had been cheap, isolated, and quiet enough to make a man hear his own thoughts too clearly, which was exactly why he took it. At 40 years old, Ethan had learned that silence could either heal a person or slowly reveal everything they were trying to outrun. His German shepherd, Rex, lay near the old kitchen doorway, ears twitching even in rest, the kind of trained stillness that came from years of sensing what others missed. Outside, the wind rolled across the empty fields in slow waves, pressing against the wooden walls like something testing for weakness. Ethan set down a worn duffel bag and exhaled, feeling the weight of long roads finally loosening from his shoulders. But then it came, a sound so faint it almost didn't belong to the world, a soft knock. Not from outside, not from the ceiling, but from beneath the floorboards beneath his boots. He froze, listening. The house did not creak like old homes usually did. This was different, rhythmic, deliberate, like a signal repeating itself beneath layers of wood and earth. Rex lifted his head instantly, eyes locked on a single point near the center of the room, his body shifting from rest to alert without hesitation. Ethan knelt slowly, placing 2 fingers on the floor, expecting nothing more than old timber settling. But instead he felt it too, a faint pulse, steady and unnatural in its precision, like something alive was sending a message upward through the structure. "That's not possible," he whispered, though his voice carried no certainty. Rex let out a low, controlled sound, not fear, but recognition, as if he had heard this language before. Ethan moved a rug aside. Then another plank shifted under his weight, revealing a narrow seam where would met something hollow beneath. The house seemed to exhale cold air through the gap, brushing against his hand like a forgotten breath from below. For a moment, everything in the room felt suspended, even the wind outside quieter than before, as if the world itself was listening. Rex stepped forward and placed his paw exactly over the seam, pressing down with quiet insistence, then looked back at Ethan with steady focus, urging him without sound. Ethan reached for a nearby tool, his mind racing between logic and instinct, between what he knew about old foundations and what he was now feeling beneath them. As the first board loosened, the sound beneath grew clearer, not louder, but more defined, repeating in a pattern too precise to be decay, too steady to be chance. And when the wood finally gave way just enough for a sliver of darkness to appear below, a cold draft rose up carrying something that made Ethan pause completely. Not fear, but the undeniable sense that whatever lay beneath this house had been waiting for him. The air inside the farmhouse shifted in a way Ethan Caldwell could not explain, not colder, not warmer, but heavier, as if the space beneath his feet had finally acknowledged being discovered. And Rex remained perfectly still, eyes locked downward through the broken seam in the floor, breathing slow and controlled like a trained sentinel refusing to break focus. Ethan leaned closer, his hand resting on the warped wood, expecting dust, old pipes, or the usual decay of forgotten construction. But instead he heard it again, clearer now, a soft repeating pulse that seemed almost mechanical in its consistency, like a message sent on a delay that had lasted far longer than it should have. The farmhouse had been built decades earlier according to the landlord, a retired woman named Eleanor Whitmore, who had only said that the place had character and a history best left undisturbed, words Ethan had dismissed at the time as sentimental exaggeration. Now those words felt different, heavier in meaning. Rex shifted slightly, pressing his nose toward the gap, inhaling slowly, then letting out a quiet breath through his nose, a behavior Ethan had learned meant recognition rather than alarm. Ethan reached for a flashlight on the counter and flicked it on, the beam slicing through the dim interior and slipping into the narrow opening between the boards, revealing not dirt or foundation, but a void, structured and intentional, as if the house had been built above something rather than into it. The edges of the opening were too clean for collapse, too straight for erosion, and Ethan's military-trained instincts from years before he tried to forget began to surface in the back of his mind, telling him that nothing natural had created this space. He lowered himself slowly, shifting another plank aside with careful pressure, and the air that rose up from beneath carried a faint metallic scent mixed with something dry and long untouched. Rex let out a single low sound, not fear, not warning, but a steady tone of attention, as if confirming what Ethan was beginning to understand. This was not part of the house, Ethan whispered, though no one else was there to hear him. The flashlight beam now revealed the outline of what looked like a narrow vertical shaft, reinforced along the sides with old wooden supports that had been deliberately placed rather than naturally formed. And at the far edge of the opening, something faintly reflective caught the light, suggesting metal or glass buried deeper below. Ethan hesitated, his mind weighing every rational explanation he had ever trusted against the undeniable evidence forming in front of him. But before he could decide his next move, Rex stepped forward and placed one paw firmly at the edge of the opening, steadying himself as if preparing for descent. The gesture was deliberate, confident, almost guiding, and Ethan felt a quiet shift in his thoughts, as if the dog understood something he had not yet reached. The farmhouse groaned softly above them as the wind outside pressed against its walls, but beneath that sound the pulse continued, steady and rhythmic, no longer just a mystery, but something that felt increasingly like a signal waiting for response. Ethan tightened his grip on the flashlight, exhaled slowly, and began clearing the remaining boards, revealing more of the hidden structure below, a space that had been sealed away from the world for reasons he could no longer ignore. And as the opening widened, the sense that they were being watched from beneath rather than above became impossible to dismiss. The moment Ethan Caldwell pulled the last loose plank away, the hidden space beneath the farmhouse seemed to respond, not with sound alone, but with a subtle shift in air pressure that made the entire room feel like it had exhaled after holding its breath for far too long. And Rex remained at the edge of the opening, perfectly steady, his amber eyes reflecting the faint glow of Ethan's flashlight, as if he already understood the importance of what lay below. Ethan angled the light downward, revealing a narrow wooden ladder built into the shaft, its rungs worn smooth but intact, descending into a darkness that felt intentional rather than accidental, like someone had designed this space to remain unseen for years, possibly decades. The rhythmic pulse that had first drawn them here continued, but now it seemed clearer, almost structured, as if it were coming from deeper within the underground space rather than the house itself, and Ethan felt a familiar tension rise in his chest, the kind he had not felt since his last years in military service, when silence often meant something was waiting to be revealed. He shifted forward slightly, careful not to disturb the fragile edges of the floor, and called softly to Rex, who responded not with hesitation but with calm readiness, stepping closer to Ethan's side, as if confirming that whatever came next would be faced together. The air rising from below carried a faint chill that did not belong to the surface world, and mixed within it was something Ethan could not immediately identify, a subtle dryness that suggested long-sealed containment, like a space that had been closed off and left untouched since another time entirely. The farmhouse above creaked gently as the wind pressed against it, but that sound felt distant now, secondary, as if the true world had shifted downward into the hidden space beneath them. Ethan tested the first rung of the ladder with his flashlight, illuminating the shaft more fully, and what he saw made his thoughts slow rather than race, because the structure below was not random or abandoned in the way old basements often are, but carefully reinforced, with beams placed in deliberate intervals, suggesting engineering rather than neglect. Rex let out a low, controlled breath and placed one paw onto the edge of the opening again, this time holding it there longer, as if anchoring himself to the threshold between two worlds. Ethan hesitated only for a moment before lowering one foot onto the ladder, feeling the solid resistance of aged wood beneath him. And as he began his descent, the pulse grew subtly stronger, no longer just something he felt through the floor, but something he could sense through the air itself, like a distant signal echoing through enclosed space. Halfway down, he paused, shining the light deeper into the void, where the shaft widened slightly into what appeared to be a constructed chamber rather than a simple crawl space. And along the walls, faint markings or fixtures hinted that this place had once served a purpose far beyond storage or foundation support. Rex remained above for a brief moment, watching intently, then, without hesitation, began his own careful descent, moving with controlled precision down the ladder behind Ethan, never breaking focus from the darkness below. As they reached the lower level together, the sound that had drawn them here seemed to settle into a steady presence. No longer just an anomaly, but a consistent rhythm embedded within the hidden structure itself. And Ethan stepped onto the underground floor, the beam of his flashlight sweeping across a sealed interior space that had clearly been preserved for reasons that were never meant to be forgotten, yet somehow were. As Ethan Caldwell stepped fully off the ladder onto the underground floor, the sensation was immediate and disorienting. Not fear, but the feeling of entering a space that had been waiting for him far longer than he had known. And the narrow beam of his flashlight revealed a sealed chamber carved beneath the farmhouse, structured with deliberate precision rather than neglect. Rex landed quietly behind him, claws clicking softly against the aged surface, then immediately froze, his body aligned toward the center of the space, as if drawn by the same unseen force that had led them this far. The air here was different, controlled and still, as though it had been preserved rather than abandoned. And Ethan slowly turned in a full circle, the flashlight revealing reinforced wooden beams along the walls, metal brackets embedded at intervals, and faint markings that suggested intentional design rather than natural formation. The rhythmic pulse they had been hearing above was now unmistakably stronger, resonating through the underground chamber itself, steady and measured like a distant mechanical heartbeat embedded somewhere deeper within the structure. Ethan moved forward carefully, each step echoing softly, and noticed that the chamber was larger than it had first appeared, extending beyond the initial descent into what looked like a connected network of underground space. Rex stayed close to his side, no longer reacting with tension but with focused calm, as if confirming that they were not in danger, but rather on the edge of something significant. Ethan swept the flashlight toward the far wall and paused, noticing a set of metal panels that did not match the age of the surrounding wood, their surfaces cleaner and more intact, suggesting they had been sealed or maintained at some point long after the original construction. He reached out slowly, fingers brushing the edge of one panel, and felt a faint vibration beneath it, synchronized with the pulse they had been following since the beginning, now clearly originating from within the underground system itself. This was never part of the house, Ethan said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, more a realization than a statement, as his military instincts began to align with what he was seeing, identifying patterns that suggested controlled access, compartmentalization, and purpose. Rex suddenly shifted his attention toward a darker corner of the chamber, stepping forward with measured confidence, then stopping again as if waiting for Ethan to follow. Ethan directed the flashlight in that direction and discovered a narrow passageway leading deeper underground, partially concealed behind a sliding section of reinforced wood that had been carefully integrated into the structure. The air flowing from that passage was slightly colder, carrying the same faint metallic undertone, but now mixed with something else, something Ethan could not immediately place, though it felt strangely familiar in a way he could not yet explain. The pulse grew clearer as they approached the passage, no longer diffused through walls and flooring, but concentrated, as if whatever was creating it was positioned only a short distance away. Rex moved first, stepping into the narrow opening without hesitation, and Ethan followed closely, keeping the light steady as they entered the deeper section of the underground structure. The passage opened gradually into a wider chamber, and as the flashlight beam expanded across the space, Ethan saw that this was not simply a hidden basement, but something far more deliberate, a preserved underground facility with organized sections, sealed compartments, and remnants of careful human engineering that suggested purpose far beyond what a simple farmhouse would ever require. The rhythmic sound now filled the space entirely, no longer distant or hidden, but present in every direction at once. And Ethan felt a growing certainty that whatever lay at the center of this underground network was not only still intact, but actively functioning in a way that defied everything he had expected to find beneath an ordinary home. As Ethan Caldwell moved deeper into the underground facility, the rhythmic pulse that had guided them from the surface now surrounded him completely, no longer felt as a distant vibration, but as a structured presence embedded within the very architecture of the space. And every step he took seemed to align with its steady timing, as if the entire underground system was synchronized to an unseen mechanism still functioning after years of isolation. Rex stayed slightly ahead now, his movements calm but deliberate, scanning each section of the chamber with focused attention, never rushing, never hesitating, as though confirming that the space itself was stable and purposeful rather than abandoned. The flashlight beam revealed more of the underground environment, showing long corridors branching outward from the main chamber, each one reinforced with aged but intentional construction, suggesting that this was not a single hidden room, but part of a larger network built beneath the farmhouse for reasons that were no longer immediately clear. Ethan paused near a junction where 3 corridors split in different directions, noticing that the pulse seemed strongest toward the center passage, and as he followed it, the air shifted again, becoming slightly warmer and more controlled, as if some form of energy or system was still regulating the environment after all this time. He reached out and touched the wall briefly, feeling a faint vibration pass through the structure, steady and consistent, like a heartbeat that refused to fade. Rex stopped abruptly ahead and turned his head toward a sealed doorway partially covered in metal plating, its surface cleaner than the surrounding materials and marked with faint, worn symbols that Ethan could not immediately interpret. He approached slowly, illuminating the doorway in full, and noticed that the sealing mechanism was not primitive or improvised, but carefully engineered, with locking components that suggested deliberate restriction rather than decay or collapse. The pulse intensified here, becoming so steady that Ethan could now hear it faintly in the silence between his breaths, and he realized that whatever system was producing it was located directly behind this sealed barrier. Rex sat down in front of the door without being commanded, maintaining eye contact with Ethan, as if waiting for a decision that would determine the next step forward. Ethan studied the mechanism carefully, his mind working through possibilities, recognizing patterns of design that suggested controlled access, possibly even preservation, rather than concealment for abandonment. The underground air remained still, yet felt charged with continuity, as if time itself had not fully disrupted whatever was operating here. Ethan exhaled slowly, then placed his hand on the edge of the metal seal, feeling a subtle vibration travel through his fingertips, confirming that the source of the rhythmic signal was directly behind it. For a moment, he did not move, absorbing the weight of the discovery, aware that whatever lay beyond this point was not random or accidental, but intentionally preserved beneath layers of earth and silence. Rex let out a low, steady breath, remaining completely calm, and Ethan understood that this was not the end of what they had uncovered, but only the threshold of something far more structured and far more significant than anything he had encountered so far beneath the farmhouse. Ethan Caldwell stood motionless in front of the sealed metal door, his hand still resting against the cold surface as the rhythmic pulse behind it continued with unwavering precision, no longer just something he felt through the structure, but something that now felt intentionally directed, as if acknowledging his presence on the other side. Rex remained seated, perfectly still, his gaze fixed on Ethan rather than the door, waiting in a way that felt less like anticipation and more like understanding, as though the dog had already accepted whatever truth was about to be revealed. The underground chamber around them remained silent except for that steady, mechanical rhythm, which now seemed to synchronize with Ethan's own breathing, creating a strange alignment between human perception and something hidden beneath layers of engineered space. Ethan slowly traced the edge of the locking mechanism, noticing fine grooves and reinforced seams that indicated this door was not meant to be opened casually, yet also not designed to be permanently inaccessible, suggesting a controlled purpose rather than abandonment or secrecy alone. He adjusted the flashlight angle and illuminated the surrounding frame more fully, revealing faint markings etched into the metal, worn by time, but still deliberately placed, as if encoding instructions or identifiers rather than decoration. The air here was slightly warmer than the surrounding corridors, reinforcing the sense that whatever lay beyond this barrier was still active in some capacity, maintained or preserved rather than forgotten. Ethan took a slow step back, evaluating the structure with a calm focus shaped by years of training, recognizing patterns of secure containment, controlled access, and layered protection that suggested something valuable or critical had been placed here with intention. Rex finally stood and moved closer to Ethan, stopping just beside him, then looked directly at the door, letting out a soft, steady breath that carried no anxiety, only quiet certainty. Ethan exhaled slowly and pressed his palm once more against the surface, feeling the pulse intensify slightly under his touch, as if responding to contact rather than resisting it. The realization settled in gradually, not as a sudden shock, but as a growing awareness that this system beneath the farmhouse was not dormant, and whatever it contained was still operating in a state of controlled continuity. He lowered his hand and turned slightly, scanning the chamber again, noticing how every corridor, every reinforced wall, every structural element seemed to converge toward this single sealed point, reinforcing the idea that this was the core of the entire underground network. Rex shifted his stance subtly, positioning himself between Ethan and the door, not as a barrier, but as if acknowledging the threshold and waiting for what came next. Ethan looked down at him for a brief moment, then back at the door, his expression steady but deeply focused, understanding that whatever decision came next would determine how far this hidden structure would continue to reveal itself. The rhythmic pulse continued without interruption, steady and deliberate, filling the silence of the underground space with a presence that felt less like machinery and more like a message still in motion, waiting for acknowledgement from someone finally, standing in front of it after a long silence of years. Ethan Caldwell remained still in front of the sealed metal door, the rhythmic pulse behind it continuing with the same precise consistency, but now it carried a subtle variation, almost like a response pattern rather than a fixed cycle, and that small change shifted everything he understood about what he was dealing with. Rex stood beside him, no longer sitting, his posture aligned with Ethan's movement, his gaze locked on the seam where the door met the frame, as if tracking something Ethan could not yet see but was beginning to feel. The underground chamber felt tighter now, not physically, but perceptually, as if the space itself was focusing attention toward the sealed threshold, compressing all silence and sound into that single point of origin. Ethan slowly stepped to the side, following the edge of the structure, running the flashlight along the frame, noticing additional markings hidden beneath layers of dust and oxidation, markings that were not random but arranged in deliberate spacing, suggesting coded organization rather than decoration or age wear. He paused at the corner of the door where a faint recessed panel was partially embedded into the wall, almost invisible unless light struck it at the correct angle, and as he adjusted the beam, he saw that the panel contained a simple mechanical interface, not electronic in a modern sense, but engineered with analog precision. Rex moved closer immediately, placing himself between Ethan and the interface for a moment, then shifting aside again as if allowing access while still observing closely, maintaining a protective awareness that felt instinctively aligned with Ethan's decision-making. Ethan studied the mechanism carefully, noting that it required physical alignment rather than force, suggesting that whatever lay beyond was not meant to be broken into, but accessed through understanding or sequence. The pulse behind the door subtly increased in clarity, and Ethan realized it was not random at all, but structured in intervals that could represent a coded pattern, something designed to be interpreted rather than simply heard. He closed his eyes briefly, listening rather than looking, and in that silence he began to recognize repetition intervals, variations in timing that hinted at intentional communication embedded within the sound itself. Rex let out a soft breath and shifted his weight slightly, his attention still fixed forward, as if confirming that Ethan was approaching the correct conclusion. Ethan reopened his eyes and carefully placed his fingers near the recessed panel, tracing its outline without activating it, sensing that even a small incorrect movement could disrupt the system's intended sequence. The underground air remained stable, but the feeling of presence intensified, as if the entire chamber was aware of their analysis and waiting for the correct response. Ethan stepped back half a foot, recalibrating his approach, and directed the flashlight once more across the sealed surface, noticing now that the door was not simply locked, but layered with multiple independent systems that suggested redundancy rather than isolation. Rex suddenly turned his head slightly toward the corridor behind them, then returned his attention forward, indicating that the space remained secure, but also reinforcing that their focus here was correct. Ethan exhaled slowly, understanding that this was not a barrier meant to keep people out randomly, but a controlled threshold designed for specific recognition, and as the rhythmic pulse continued its steady, evolving pattern, he realized that whatever lay behind the door was not simply hidden underground, but actively maintained in a state of structured continuity, waiting for the correct sequence to allow further access. The sealed door remained unchanged in appearance, yet Ethan Caldwell could no longer see it as a static barrier, because the rhythmic pulse behind it had evolved into a structured pattern that felt increasingly deliberate, as if the system on the other side was not only active but also responsive to their presence and analysis. Rex stood perfectly still beside him, his posture aligned with Ethan's focus, no longer scanning the surrounding corridors, but instead fixed entirely on the sealed threshold, as though confirming that everything in this underground network converged on this single point. Ethan slowly lowered the flashlight, allowing the beam to rest across the recessed mechanical panel, and noticed again the precise arrangement of its components, each element positioned with engineering intent that suggested controlled access rather than simple locking. The air between them and the door felt subtly different now, less like still underground space and more like a controlled environment, and Ethan began to recognize faint variations in temperature that implied systems still regulating conditions beyond the barrier. He stepped closer and carefully traced the edge of the panel with his eyes, identifying faint alignment markers that suggested a sequence-based mechanism, something that required timing or synchronization rather than force or guesswork. Rex suddenly shifted his attention slightly upward, then back to the door, maintaining his position without tension, reinforcing Ethan's growing understanding that this was not a threat in the traditional sense, but a structured system awaiting proper interaction. Ethan closed his eyes again for a brief moment, focusing entirely on the pulse, and now the rhythm revealed subtle layers he had not noticed before, variations in intensity that repeated in a consistent cycle, almost like coded intervals embedded within the sound itself. He opened his eyes and stepped half a pace back, recalibrating his perspective, realizing that the door was not simply sealed, but part of a larger operational design that extended far beyond this chamber. The underground space around them remained silent, yet that silence felt engineered, not natural, as if sound itself had been controlled or minimized to allow focus on the central mechanism. Rex took one slow step forward, placing himself directly in front of Ethan but not blocking him, instead positioning himself as if acknowledging the importance of what lay ahead while still remaining calm and observant. Ethan raised the flashlight once more and carefully scanned the entire surface of the door, noticing for the first time that faint channels extended outward from the central frame, suggesting a distributed system rather than a single locking point. He followed those lines visually, tracing them across the wall until they disappeared into the surrounding structure, confirming that the sealed entrance was integrated into a much larger underground network. The pulse behind the door continued steadily, but now it felt less like a signal and more like a sustained operational state, something maintained continuously rather than triggered intermittently. Ethan exhaled slowly, understanding that any attempt to force entry would be meaningless, because this system was not designed to resist intrusion, but to recognize. Authorization. Rex let out a soft, controlled breath and remained fixed in place, his attention unwavering, as if waiting for Ethan to reach the same conclusion without further prompting. Ethan lowered his hand from the panel and stood still for a long moment, absorbing the realization that the entire underground facility was not abandoned, not inactive, and not forgotten, but instead preserved in a functioning condition that had continued long after the farmhouse above had been left to silence. For a long moment Ethan Caldwell stood in complete stillness in front of the sealed underground door, not because he was uncertain of what he had found, but because every instinct he trusted told him that the next action would determine the nature of everything hidden beneath the farmhouse. The rhythmic pulse behind the door continued with unwavering precision, no longer feeling like a distant mechanical function, but now like a structured response awaiting interaction, as if the system itself was observing him in return. Rex remained at his side, perfectly calm, his posture aligned with Ethan's focus, his amber eyes fixed on the sealed frame without hesitation, reinforcing the sense that nothing about this moment was accidental or random. Ethan slowly raised the flashlight once more, scanning the recessed panel and surrounding structure, noticing again how every detail of the door's system suggested layered engineering, not decay or abandonment, but preservation with intent. The faint markings etched into the metal frame now felt more deliberate than ever, their spacing and repetition suggesting a pattern that extended beyond visual design into functional purpose. Ethan exhaled slowly and shifted his weight, stepping slightly closer to the panel, allowing himself to fully observe the alignment points that seemed to correspond with the rhythm of the pulse. It was then that he realized the pattern was not simply repetitive, but structured in cycles that repeated with minor variations, almost like a coded sequence waiting for recognition. Rex let out a quiet breath and adjusted his stance, moving half a step forward, as if confirming Ethan's awareness of the same conclusion, without needing any verbal exchange. The underground chamber around them remained completely still, yet the silence now felt intentional rather than empty, as if the space itself had been designed to suppress distraction and focus attention entirely on the sealed threshold. Ethan carefully lowered his hand from the panel and began tracing the surrounding frame with his eyes again, recognizing for the first time that the entire doorway was integrated into a larger system that extended beyond visible boundaries, with faint structural lines leading into the surrounding walls and disappearing into the underground architecture. The realization shifted his understanding completely, transforming the door from an isolated barrier into a central node within a controlled network that had been maintained with purpose. Rex suddenly turned his head slightly toward Ethan, then back to the door, maintaining calm focus, reinforcing the sense that whatever lay beyond was not danger in the conventional sense, but something awaiting proper engagement. Ethan closed his eyes briefly once more, allowing the rhythmic pulse to guide his attention, and in that silence he perceived subtle variations in timing that suggested intentional sequencing rather than random operation, like a system designed to respond only when correctly interpreted. He opened his eyes and stepped back half a pace, no longer treating the door as something to be opened by force or discovery alone, but as something that required alignment with its internal logic. The flashlight beam steadied across the sealed surface, revealing once again the precision of its construction, every edge and seam reinforcing the idea of controlled preservation. Rex remained still, grounded and attentive, his presence steady beside Ethan as the underground chamber continued its quiet, structured hum. Ethan lowered his hand completely, understanding now that whatever lay behind the sealed door was not simply hidden, but intentionally sustained in a functioning state, waiting for the correct recognition to allow the next stage of access. In the underground chamber beneath the farmhouse, Ethan Caldwell remained motionless for several seconds, not because he lacked direction, but because the system in front of him had reached a level of intentional complexity that demanded patience rather than action, and the rhythmic pulse behind the sealed door continued with unwavering stability, no longer feeling like an unknown signal, but like a structured presence maintaining itself over time. Rex stood beside him, still and focused, his attention fixed on the sealed threshold with a calm intensity that mirrored Ethan's own understanding that this moment was not about force or urgency, but about alignment with something already in motion. Ethan slowly stepped back from the door, allowing the flashlight beam to widen across the entire sealed structure, and for the first time he noticed a subtle shift in the surrounding chamber, as if the environment itself was reacting to their prolonged presence. The air carried a faint but steady vibration that seemed to synchronize with the pulse beyond the door, and Ethan realized that the underground system was not isolated, but integrated into a broader network that extended beyond this single access point. He turned slowly, scanning the chamber walls again, and noticed additional structural channels that he had overlooked earlier, thin and precise conduits embedded into the architecture, suggesting controlled distribution of energy or signals throughout the underground complex. Rex suddenly shifted his stance, stepping slightly forward, then pausing, as if acknowledging a change in the system that Ethan had not yet fully interpreted. Ethan lowered the flashlight and closed his eyes briefly, focusing entirely on the rhythm he had been following since their descent, and in doing so he recognized a final layer of structure within the pulse, a variation that repeated in longer cycles, indicating a multi-stage sequence rather than a single continuous signal. When he opened his eyes again, the sealed door no longer felt like an endpoint, but like a controlled interface within a larger operational framework, designed not to block access indefinitely, but to regulate entry based on recognition of pattern and timing. He stepped closer once more, not with urgency, but with measured precision, allowing himself to observe the recessed mechanism in full alignment with the rhythm he now understood as structured communication. Rex remained perfectly calm, positioned slightly behind and to the side of Ethan, maintaining awareness of both the door and the surrounding chamber without distraction. The underground space felt increasingly coherent, as if every element had been placed with deliberate intention to support a functioning system that had continued long after the surface world had forgotten it existed. Ethan exhaled slowly and placed his hand near the edge of the panel without activating it, sensing that the mechanism was not reactive to touch alone, but to synchronization with the underlying pattern he had begun to interpret. The rhythmic pulse continued steadily behind the door, now less mysterious and more like a confirmation of presence, and Ethan understood that whatever lay beyond this sealed threshold was not dormant or abandoned, but preserved in a sustained state of operation, waiting for the correct sequence of recognition to transition to its next stage. For the first time since descending into the underground facility, Ethan Caldwell felt a subtle shift in the system's behavior that was not caused by movement or interpretation, but by a structural transition within the rhythmic pulse itself, as if the sealed door ahead was no longer simply responding to observation, but preparing for interaction. Rex remained still beside him, his posture steady and aligned, but his focus had intensified, eyes fixed on the recessed panel as though recognizing that the environment had entered a new phase of operation. Ethan stepped closer to the sealed mechanism, careful and deliberate, and noticed that the pulse was no longer uniform in its earlier pattern, but now layered with alternating intervals that repeated in a structured cycle, suggesting a multi-phase sequence embedded within the system. He raised the flashlight and examined the markings around the frame once more, and this time the patterns appeared clearer, not as decoration or wear, but as deliberate alignment indicators corresponding to the variations in the pulse. The underground chamber itself seemed to respond subtly, the faint vibration in the air becoming more coherent, as if multiple elements of the hidden infrastructure were synchronizing toward a shared state. Ethan closed his eyes briefly again, focusing entirely on the rhythm, and in that moment he understood that the system was not passive or observational, but interactive, designed to register recognition through timing rather than force. Rex shifted his stance slightly, stepping half a pace forward, then stopping again, maintaining a calm but attentive presence that reinforced Ethan's growing certainty that they were approaching a threshold event rather than a simple locked barrier. Ethan opened his eyes and slowly moved his hand toward the recessed panel, not activating it yet, but aligning his movements with the rhythm he had now begun to interpret as a coded sequence. The air felt denser near the door, not heavier in pressure but concentrated in awareness, as if the chamber itself was narrowing its focus to this single point of potential transition. He carefully adjusted his position, matching the subtle timing variations in the pulse, and for the first time he sensed a minimal change in the system's response, almost imperceptible, but enough to indicate recognition of alignment. Rex remained completely still, his presence steady and grounded, as if confirming that no external threat was present, only a controlled system awaiting proper engagement. Ethan exhaled slowly, maintaining synchronization with the rhythm, and noticed that the vibration behind the door had shifted again, now reflecting a stable repetition that mirrored his adjusted timing. The sealed structure no longer felt like an obstacle, but like an interface designed to evaluate consistency, and Ethan understood that the underground facility was operating on principles far beyond simple mechanical locking. Every element around him, from the reinforced walls to the faint structural channels in the chamber, now appeared to function as part of a unified system designed for continuity rather than isolation. He lowered his hand slightly, holding position rather than acting prematurely, and allowed the rhythm to stabilize fully around them. Rex leaned forward just slightly, then settled again, remaining attentive but calm, reinforcing the sense that they had reached the precise moment where understanding and system alignment converged. The pulse continued without interruption, now fully synchronized with Ethan's perception, and the sealed door stood not as a barrier, but as a final threshold awaiting confirmation of access through perfect structural harmony. In the underground chamber beneath the farmhouse, Ethan Caldwell maintained his position in front of the sealed door as the rhythmic system reached a level of stability that no longer felt like an external signal, but rather like a fully synchronized state between his presence and the hidden mechanism beyond the barrier. Rex stood beside him, perfectly composed, his body no longer shifting or reacting, but instead holding a steady alignment with Ethan's timing, as if both of them had entered the same controlled rhythm as the underground structure itself. The pulse behind the door had now settled into a consistent multi-layered pattern, no longer changing unpredictably, but repeating in structured intervals that felt precise enough to be measured and anticipated. Ethan slowly raised his hand toward the recessed panel, not touching it yet, but hovering at a distance that allowed him to observe subtle changes in response. And for the first time, he noticed a faint mechanical adjustment within the system, as if the structure had acknowledged his proximity. The sealed door did not open, but something within its framework shifted almost imperceptibly, and the air pressure around the frame changed slightly, confirming that the system was actively engaged with his presence. Rex stepped forward half a pace, then stopped, maintaining a calm stance, his gaze fixed on the exact point where Ethan's hand hovered near the panel. Ethan exhaled slowly and adjusted his position, carefully aligning his movements with the rhythm that had now become fully predictable, each interval forming part of a structured cycle that appeared to evaluate consistency rather than force or intrusion. The underground chamber around them remained still, yet no longer felt passive, as every surface and structural element seemed integrated into the same system, reinforcing the idea that this was not a single sealed door, but a controlled interface within a much larger operational network. Ethan closed his eyes briefly and synchronized his breathing with the pulse, and in doing so he sensed a subtle confirmation within the system, a minimal but distinct response that suggested partial recognition had been achieved. When he opened his eyes, he noticed that the recessed panel had shifted slightly, not opening, but adjusting position in a way that indicated internal alignment rather than external pressure. Rex remained steady, his posture unchanged, but his attention had intensified, focused entirely on the door, as if awaiting a transition point that was approaching. Ethan carefully maintained his position, no longer testing or probing, but holding steady within the established rhythm, and as he did, the pulse behind the door reached a new level of coherence, all layers of timing aligning into a unified sequence. The sealed structure now felt less like a barrier and more like a calibrated threshold, designed to respond only when full synchronization was achieved. Ethan slowly lowered his hand, not retreating, but maintaining presence within the system's recognition field, and the chamber responded with a faint but unmistakable shift in ambient vibration, confirming that the process was still active and continuing to evaluate. Rex stood firm beside him, completely calm, as both remained in the center of a hidden system that was no longer simply waiting, but actively preparing for the next stage of controlled access. In the underground chamber beneath the farmhouse, Ethan Caldwell stood perfectly still as the sealed door finally responded in a way that was no longer subtle or interpretive, but unmistakably structural, as the rhythmic system reached full synchronization and the entire sealed mechanism shifted with a controlled internal release. Rex remained beside him, calm and focused, his posture unchanged, but his attention locked on the exact point where the recessed panel had been aligning with Ethan's previous movements, as if confirming that the threshold had reached its final validation stage. The air around the door changed first, not violently, but with a precise redistribution of pressure that Ethan could feel across his skin, followed by a faint internal sound of mechanical disengagement hidden deep within the structure. The pulse that had guided them from the surface, through the farmhouse, and into the underground facility now reached perfect unity, all layers converging into a single continuous rhythm that no longer felt like separate signals, but like one integrated system completing a long sequence. Ethan did not move immediately, instead maintaining position, understanding that any deviation at this moment could interrupt a process that had clearly been designed to require exact synchronization. Rex stepped forward slightly, then stopped again, as if acknowledging that the transition point had been reached, but still respecting the system's timing. Then, without warning or force, the sealed door shifted inward by a fraction of an inch, not opening fully, but unlocking its internal alignment, and a faint line of light appeared along the edge of the frame from within the hidden chamber beyond. Ethan's breathing slowed as he observed the change, recognizing that this was not a mechanical failure or structural collapse, but a deliberate response to correct sequence completion. The rhythmic pulse did not stop, but transformed, becoming softer and more stable, as if entering a maintenance state rather than an active signaling cycle. Rex remained completely steady, his gaze fixed on the widening seam of light, while Ethan carefully raised the flashlight and directed it toward the opening. The beam revealed the first glimpse of the chamber beyond, showing a cleanly maintained interior space that contrasted sharply with the aged underground corridors they had passed through, suggesting that whatever lay beyond this door had been preserved under significantly different conditions. Ethan took a slow step forward, not crossing the threshold yet, but preparing to observe more closely, and as he did, the door continued its controlled movement, revealing more of the interior in a gradual and deliberate manner. The system had not simply granted access. It had transitioned them into a new stage of the underground network, one that appeared to be fully intact, operational, and maintained beyond all expectation. Rex followed closely at Ethan's side, and together they stood at the edge of a hidden chamber that had remained sealed beneath the farmhouse for an unknown period of time, now finally responding to the exact sequence required for its activation.